Understanding and implementing federated sharing. Sometimes in the course of your business, you may find that you and another organization will need to share information, perhaps calendar information, perhaps free busy information, perhaps any of the information that's involved in your exchange organization. And you are two separate organizations, and you don't necessarily want to join your exchange organizations together, but all you really want to do is provide some mechanism so that someone else in some other organization can make use of the information that you have. Now, in Exchange 2010, one of the ways that you can go about doing this without actually combining the two organizations is through the process called federated sharing, or federation trusts. Now, federation is essentially a process by which one organization trusts another one. To quote Microsoft's website, federation is a trust-based agreement between two organizations with some common purpose, such that both want authentication assertions from one organization to be recognized by another. What this means is that you and this other organization trust each other in such a way that you are willing to share certain quantities of data with each other. Now, one of the ways that this can be implemented is obviously just to join your two forests. Right? If you create a trust, an Active Directory trust, this is the same thing as more or less the social trust between your two organizations. But creating that Active Directory trust isn't necessarily something you want to do with all of your partners. Right? If that partner is also a competitor in other ways, you probably wouldn't want to join your forests together. What Federation provides you the ability to do, making use of the Microsoft Federation Gateway here, is to create a sense of trust with a shared intermediary. In the case of the Microsoft Federation Gateway, that shared intermediary is Microsoft itself. And so what happens then, from a very basic perspective, is your organization sits over here on the left, this is you, and another organization sits over here on the right, and Microsoft sits in the middle. We'll put a little M here for Microsoft, right? You create a trust relationship with Microsoft. Your partner organization, or the one that you want to create the federation with, creates a trust with Microsoft. And by virtue of this joint trust with this shared intermediary, you then trust each other. This trust can be limited to certain types of data sharing. And in the case of Exchange 2010, these are generally related to calendar sharing and free busy information. But then you can then use this to actually forward information back and forth and share calendars and do all the nice things that are associated with Outlook and calendaring. Now, this particular nugget, it's actually somewhat difficult for me to demonstrate a lot of the processes of creating federated sharing. The requirements are pretty substantial. The X509 certificate from a trusted CA can be somewhat expensive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to step you through some of the processes here, but help you understand how you might do this if you wanted to implement sharing with you and another organization. The benefit here is that Microsoft Federation Gateway and the automation that it creates that allows you to very quickly set up a connection, set up a trust relationship with the Microsoft Federation Gateway, identify the other domains that you want to share information with, and simply go about your merry way. Now, the four general steps that are involved with doing this, step one is involved with actually obtaining an X509 certificate from a trusted CA. Then you use that certificate to actually create the Federation Trust. I'll show you how we do that inside of the interface here. You then provide domain ownership verification, domain ownership proof through a DNS TXT record. I'll show you how to do that as well. You're going to be asserting your app ID using that DNS TXT record. And then essentially you create an organization relationship policy and or a sharing policy to identify, well, what do you want to share, and then potentially even as far down as what users do you want to provide sharing access to. The most important part of this here is the fact that you need to be aware that these X509 certificates are only the types of certificates that Microsoft supports for the Federation Gateway are not from all of the trusted CAs in existence. There are only a limited set of trusted CAs that the Federation Gateway supports. And knowing exactly who those are is not necessarily critically important. Just be aware when you go to actually create your own federation that you're going to have to get the right X509 certificate from the right trusted CA in order for this to work. So assume at this point that you have a certificate. For the purposes of this demo, let's just assume that we have some certificate that we can play with to create this Federation trust. And then using that, we're actually going to go through the providing the domain ownership and then creating that organizational relationship. Here we are back in our Exchange Management Console here, and you'll notice that I'm looking at the Organization Configuration node here, and I'm flipped up here to Federation Trust. Now at this point, there are no Federation trusts that have been created for this organization. If I want, I need to go and create that new Federation trust, and really at this point, all I have to do is enter in the thumbprint of the certificate that I want to use. Now, this certificate will be deployed automatically to all the Exchange client access servers or hub transport servers so that they'll be able to make use of the trust and share the information that they need to. But simply you hit the browse button here, and if you have a certificate that has been installed to your certificate store that is the correct type of certificate for this sort of federation, then it will be available here. You can click the certificate, click the new button, and establish that Federation trust. Now at this point, you are setting up that trust with the Microsoft Federation Gateway. This is this step right here that you're doing. Once you've done that, you then trust Microsoft, and then after that period of time, then you can identify who are the other domains that you want to trust the information sharing to occur with. So let's assume that you just click the new button there and you've created this Federation trust. Now, as I said before, the second step in this is the third step in this, once the trust has been created, is the need to prove your domain ownership through a DNS TXT record. Now, when you create this Federation trust, you are going to create more or less a unique identifier for the application that you're creating. It's called an app ID. And this app ID is essentially what you need to create inside of your DNS zones. If we go back here to this server, and we go back to Start, Administrative Tools, and DNS, the third step here involves going to your forward lookup zone here for the nuggetlab.com and creating another new record of type TXT. If I create the record, I want to actually leave the record name blank because I want this to be related to the parent domain. And then I want to enter in the text that's provided for me when I create the Federation, the trust relationship. And in this case, the text is app ID and then followed with some unique identifier for that app ID. Yours is not going to be this number. It'll be something unique for whoever you are. Once you've done that, you'll find that this text record is available here under nuggetlab.com. And this is the record that other people will use to verify that you are who you are and that your relationship has been established with Microsoft. That gets the third step down. You are now trusted with Microsoft. The final step you have to do is actually identify who are your relationships that you want to, who else is out there? Who do you want to create as an organizational relationship? Maybe you want to trust Contoso.com. And in doing that, you want to enable free busy information access with time only or with time plus subject and location. Maybe you want to specify a security distribution group that indicates what internal users are accessible. Maybe you don't necessarily want to share all of your FreeBusy information, but only a certain subset of that FreeBusy information as a basis of the security groups that are out there in your organization. This can be considered a good thing, especially if you are both working with, partnering with, and also competing with the organization that you're trusting information with. After you define what that organizational relationship is going to be, actually I should mention down here federated delivery is an option, but right now in this version of Exchange, the RTM version, this function doesn't really work right now. But once you've defined what that relationship is going to contain, then you need to identify who that other organization is going to be. Now you can automatically discover their configuration information if they have set up their auto-discover service that is available at their perimeter. We're going to talk about the auto-discover service just a little bit later in a future nugget. But be aware that there is a service out there that you can use to auto-discover that organization's configuration information. If they don't have that configuration information out there, then you can identify who you want to federate with. Contoso.com, for example. Here's the federated domains. They may have a URI, they're going to have a URI as well for that external Exchange organization. They're also going to have an auto-discover endpoint, for example. Once you've populated this information in, That'll create the organization relationship and begin the process of sharing information between yourself and the other organization. Now, the last thing we have to be conscious of is not only these organization relationships, but another policy that I kind of purposely glossed over back when we were talking about the mailbox server role. And that's these sharing policies here. Now, by default, we have a default sharing policy, and that default sharing policy identifies what we are going to share. Right? In this case, the default sharing policy is sharing calendar sharing with free busy information to all domains. It is here that you can lock down a little bit more information if you want about what sort of calendar sharing, contact sharing, what have you, that you want to do with that other organization. Free busy information, plus subject and location, plus contact sharing or not contact sharing, etc. Once you've identified what this is, then you can further lock down to specific mailboxes that this sharing policy applies to. So this gives you the ability of setting an organizational policy and then an individual policy for certain types of mailboxes. And you can do this at any point to determine what that sharing is going to be. This is really the process of doing federated sharing. And there's admittedly a lot more under the covers that's going on, and federation involves some fairly substantial claims that are involved back and forth between you and Microsoft and the other organization. But really setting up these policies, because we have this Microsoft Federated Sharing Gateway or this Microsoft Federation Gateway available, that makes a lot of this process relatively easy. And if you have other organizations out there that you want to share things like contact information or calendar information, you can do so because that gateway exists and because you trust Microsoft to be that point of trust between the two of you. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about the process of understanding and implementing federated sharing. And admittedly, we didn't really spend too much time walking through the demonstration, but what we did do is explain what federation is, how you can leverage the Microsoft Federation Gateway to create that federation trust, and also how and what your Exchange users get out of creating federated sharing. We showed those 4 Federation Trust steps involved with creating that or obtaining that X509 certificate from a trusted CA, and to make sure that that is a trusted CA that is also supported by the Microsoft Federation Gateway. We went through the process of creating that Federation Trust and then also creating the correct DNS records so that we can actually visibly display that domain ownership. And then finally creating that organizational relationship and or a sharing policy to tailor exactly what we want to share with another organization. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.